Welcome to the Grove Podcast, where we feature Evergreen members and their real-life stories of salvation, transformation, struggle, and hope. I'm Joy Gabbert, and today we have the Coffmans. We have Ed and Janet Coffman. Welcome to the Grove.
Thank you.
Yeah. So our beginning questions: how long have you guys been married? Do you have children? And where do you each serve at Evergreen?
We've been married 40 years this coming September. Mm-hmm. We have one daughter. We've been members of Evergreen for 24 years.
I teach Sunday school, adult Sunday school. I team teach with Ken Puthers, and I also serve on the security team.
All right. Well, why don't we start, Janet, with your background and like your childhood and how you came to know the Lord?
You know, I say this all the time, but I don't ever remember a time that I didn't love Jesus. Mm-hmm. I can nail down the moment that I knew that I needed Jesus at about age 9. And Brother Farrell was giving the invitation, and I was sitting there with my mom, and I thought, yeah, that's exactly what I need to do. I need to do that now. Mm-hmm. But my mother wouldn't let me. She didn't think I was old enough to make that type of decision. And so it was not until I was 17 that I actually was able to follow through with what I knew to be true and was baptized.
Tell me about, so you're 17. Tell me about a little bit that happened afterwards. You went to camp?
I did. They had a particular speaker one night during this camp, and he spoke on missions, and he told a story about a family that was serving in South America in Colombia, and they had been killed. And I remember hearing the details of that story, and he didn't go into a lot of detail, of course, because there were teenagers there, but I remember hearing the details of that story and going, I'm never doing that. Mm. I remember saying to the Lord, I am never going to be a missionary.
How did your life go after camp?
I spent a lot of my years not walking closely with the Lord. Married a man that never was faithful, had a daughter. Fast forward 5 years later, and I find myself divorced and raising a child on my own. We moved to Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. I got a job at a bank in Jinx, and then a new bank was opening at 81st and Yale called Valley National Bank. I took that job, and that's where I met Ed.
What do you think happened where you stopped chasing the Lord? You were living your own life.
I've often caught myself saying it was because I didn't have a strong foundation of discipleship. Mm-hmm. I knew that I knew the Lord. That never ever occurred to me that I was not a believer. I just wanted what I wanted more. There were lots of times in between those first years of moving out on my own and the time when Ed and I got married that I can look back and I can see the times that the Lord reached out to me and the way that he provided a word from what most people would think was a random conversation. But even as far away from the Lord as I was, I knew at those times when I was having those conversations, I knew that he was reminding me of who I belonged to.
So Ed, why don't we hear your backstory?
I grew up in a tiny town of about 700 people, and that's about 225 miles straight north of here. I attended church when I was a little kid because my mother made me. And when I was in the 7th grade, she came into my bedroom one Sunday morning and told me that I was old enough to make up my own mind. And she let me decide whether or not I was going to continue going to church. And I knew right then and there that God answered prayers, and I told her I was not going to church anymore, and I shut the door on church, and I never had any intention of going back.
Okay.
In my way of thinking, they were teaching me to be a good person, mm-hmm. and I was already a good person in my mind, so they had nothing to offer for me. Yeah. And that was a sarcastic attitude for a 13-year-old, but that's kind of the way I looked at it. I don't remember. And I'm trying not to be too hard on the church that I went to as a child, but I don't remember people carrying Bibles to church. I don't remember them talking about scripture. I remember topical sermons about being a good person, but I don't remember Christ and relationships going on there.
So then, after 7th grade, then what happened?
I went off to college and I did my thing, and I ended up here in Tulsa. I was a member of the Tulsa Police Department. They hired me right out of college.
Okay.
And I went through the police academy and kind of did my thing. And Janet mentioned she worked at Valley Bank. Well, you see police officers working what we call extra jobs or part-time jobs aside from our police work. And a lot of times that involves a bank. And I worked at the bank where she was working.
Okay.
And we became friends and we talked. We had similar backgrounds. She grew up in rural Arkansas and I grew up in rural Kansas. And so we became friends pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And we started to date and we fell in love and got married.
Okay.
And
so how old were you guys about this time?
I was 30 and Janet was 28.
Okay.
So
So
we were
you
not
were just
young.
out of church from 7th grade and through this time.
Never to return.
Okay. Yeah. So what was the attitude when you got married? Janet, were you going to church at this time? Were you trying to get him to come with you or not in church?
We were not going to church. I can remember having conversations with him when we were dating. And one time we'd been dating for a while and I just flat out asked him, do you believe in God? And he was like, well, yeah, why? And I said, well, how about going to church or anything? And he basically told me what he just said. Well, why? And because I was where I was, I thought, okay, well, he's a good guy. But after we got married, that changed.
And I knew that she had a deeper understanding of quote unquote religious things than I had. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of a deficiency I was willing to overlook in her because I wasn't interested, but I knew she had probably more of a pull to maybe be back in church because I knew she'd been in church at one time.
So then when did things change?
I had a part-time job and a young woman that was working there invited me to go to her church, and she went to a Free Will Baptist church in Tulsa. And I thought, why not? I've been kind of waiting for somebody to invite me. And so I started going, liked it. I'd ask him to go, and he'd go, yeah, well, maybe one of these times.
But for me, it changed. There was a young couple that moved in across the street from us. Tim and Jenny Hetrick were their names, and they were just starting a family, and they had some kids while they were over there. And Tim was... Again, the term I would have used back then would have been religious. He was religious. He was a Bible thumper. But I liked him. He's a really good guy. He was fun to be around. We lifted weights together. We did stuff together. And he would talk about Jesus and I'd kind of just shut it off, but he would tell me, about Jesus. And I knew that he lived the life that he was speaking of. One Sunday or one week, he asked me, he said, hey, I've got some kids in my Sunday school class. They were involved in the youth at First Baptist BA. And he said, would you come and talk to the kids in my class? Because go ahead.
Of a case that he had just worked. It was a drunk driving case that had hit a child and the child was killed. Tim had heard the story. And so he thought, okay, you know what? This just might work.
So anyway, I didn't want to do that. But I said, yeah, because I liked him and I wanted to do whatever I could to make him happy. So I went in and I talked to the boys at Sunday school and we got done and it went fine. And then afterwards, I was standing at the front of the room with Tim, our daughter Stacy, me, and there might have been a couple other people up there. And my daughter looked at me and she said, how does a person know if they're going to go to heaven? I didn't know. And so I looked at Tim and I said, Tim, could you explain that to Stacy? Could you tell her? Could you give her an answer? And he walked through the gospel. And when he got done, I thought, I'm going to hell. And so from that point on, I started reading my Bible at home, like in a safety and the privacy of my home. And I thought, well, maybe there's something in there. Maybe there's a loophole in there somewhere. And, I there was nothing on my radar, but the fear of going to hell. I read the Bible for probably 2 or 3 weeks and tried to find some reason not to believe it. And I couldn't find a reason not to believe it. And so I prayed to receive Christ in the privacy of my own home in May of 1991.
Okay, so after that point, you guys are on fire, you're getting involved in your church. Were you guys thinking at all about long-term missions?
Not really. There was a lot of home mission stuff going on. And it wasn't until a little later that we started with some other mission trips that people were coming in and speaking with the mission pastor about that were overseas. We never participated in those. And it wasn't until much later that we were no longer members at that church and we had just started going to church here. And our friends that were instrumental in Ed's salvation, they took a job with the International Mission Board as missionaries to Saigon, Vietnam.
Okay. Let's pause from that for just a second. Tell me about how you guys found Evergreen.
We had left our former church and we were not in a really good place spiritually. And so for about a year, we struggled trying to find another church. My uncle was on staff with Michael at the time, and he started telling me that they were going to start this church. Well, I was not interested at all, and so I kept saying, gee, that's nice. Hope you have a good time. And so I watched church on TV because he was working on Sundays for a long time. I had a friend of mine who every Monday morning, she would leave me a message on our phone and ask me what church did I attend on Sunday morning. She was God really used her for that. And I was thankful that every week she stayed faithful in asking, where are you going to church? Because she knew we needed to be there. Well, one Sunday morning I get up and I find myself getting ready to go to church. I don't know where I'm going, but I'm getting myself ready to go to church. And the whole time I'm getting myself ready, I'm asking the Lord, okay, Lord, where am I going? And right as I am ready to walk out the door, I remember what my uncle said. So I'm scrambling around trying to find some information. I find information. This is before cell phones. I find the information and I show up. And he is just over the moon thrilled. And I sit in the back of the room and I listen to Michael Gabbert and I went, hallelujah. I'm home. I come home. I tell him. I said, well, I think, I might have found it. And so he said, okay, well, we'll go the next week. So we get there.
And they were backing trailers up and they were unloading them and they had sound equipment and they were working like crazy just to meet together.
Yeah.
And I told Janet, I said, these people must love the Lord and they must love each other because this is not easy. There's an easier way to do this. You could go anywhere and not have to go through this. But, everybody seemed like it was a time of fellowship and they were enjoying their fellowship and then they were going to praise and worship. And study the word. And it was just really, I was blown away the first time I was there. And I told her, I said, we can be a part of this.
Being with Evergreen from its beginnings, tell me a little bit about the church then.
We did everything. I mean, we set everything up. We tore everything down every week. We were in the hotel. We moved over to Thoreau Academy in the school. Same process.
And when you didn't know people, even though Janet's uncle was on staff, we didn't really know people. I knew Michael's dad because he was on the police department. Because we had to set up and tear down, this work before and this work after church was in our DNA. And so that's how you kind of developed community and fellowship. And it was just part of our culture. That's what we did. I mean, we've always been that way. That's why I think to this day, we have a group of people who aren't afraid to work because we've always worked. Even if you weren't a part of it in the beginning, it's just part of the culture here.
Sure.
It were those charter members that took Ed and I under their wing and we did life together. You've spoken and done podcasts with people that you've only heard a part of their testimonies. And we've been fortunate enough to walk together with them through those other testimonies.
I remember when we met, you mentioned how in those beginning years, what was the driving force behind the church and getting it started were your prayer times together.
Prayer has always been in our DNA as well as working. We watched God answer prayers and do huge things in those early years. And so it was just part of it.
It's really cool that you guys have been here pretty much from the beginning.
Yeah.
And have been able to see it go from a hotel to our big building that we have today. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so now 2001, you guys hear from your friends And they're in where? Vietnam?
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about that.
Well, because we were so tight, we knew that within the first year, we wanted to go see them. We wanted to go spend time with them and serve with them. Mm-hmm. And so it was right at a year, and we made plans, and that was our first trip overseas, was to go to Saigon, and we spent 10 days with them.
Was that just a vacation kind of trip?
Any kind of trip we've taken like that, it's always been a mission. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
Yeah, Vietnam was a little different because, you know, when we were in Thailand, we didn't have to do anything in secret. And in Vietnam, it was very, you had to be very secretive, and you couldn't do anything in the open. And Tim and Jenny would have Bible studies, and they focused on, you know, young adults. And so we got to go to several gatherings when they had young adults in their home. Mm-hmm. And everything, like I said, had to be very, very secretive, and we couldn't broadcast it. But we got to be in several of those gatherings. And for me, it kind of sparked an interest, but not as much as a later trip did.
Well, then there was a second trip.
And then the second trip happened, and we were here, and we were going to go. And then we thought, you know what? Maybe we should take somebody with us. Pastor Scott showed up, and Brian Martin, and Kent Thiessen.
And then Ben. Part of what the guys did, Janet stayed with Tim and Jenny in their apartment.
Okay.
And then the guys, we stayed in the backpack district and little hotel there. And one of the things we got to do was we took some packages, and Tim couldn't do this with us because he couldn't really be associated with us, but because we were being watched all the time we were there. Sure. But we also, I should back up, we also took 150 Bibles in, Vietnamese Bibles in. Didn't get searched, anything. Wow. They got all the way through, and so we were able to distribute those. But we would take packages, and we would put a Vietnamese Bible, we would put Vietnamese tracts, and we would put a VHS, shows you how long ago it was, copy of the Jesus film in Vietnamese, and we'd wrap them in orange plastic. And then we did, I guess we put together maybe 40 or 50 of those. I'm not even sure how many. And we hired a driver, and we went out into the countryside. The plan was, Tim asked us just to kind of hide them, but sort of not hide them in rural areas. And he said, eventually someone will find this package, and they'll open it up and see what it is, and they'll read it. He said they're Vietnamese, and they will read it. They'd had reports of little church groups starting in homes out of that were a result of people finding these packages. They'd had good reports about doing that. And so we got to take part in doing that. And that's kind of what we did at the first part of the trip.
I love that. How many packages did you guys hide?
Probably, I'm guessing 30 or 40. And then whenever we would get out of that driver's view, we would maybe drop a package here, toss one over here, just try to put it somewhere where maybe it'd take a couple of days to find it, so that they couldn't necessarily associate us with the package, because if they associated with us with the package, they might be able to associate us with Tim and Jenny and the missionaries, which would not have been a good thing. Yeah. While we were there, and we all got to speak to different groups. Janet got to speak to the largest group by far, but the rest of us spoke to smaller groups, maybe 10 or 12 people in the group. And out of those small groups, Janet and I ended up meeting with a young couple. Neither one of them knew anything about Christ. And so we were able to share the gospel with them and explain what we knew about the gospel and Christ's love for them. And neither one of them made a decision that day.
Then they contacted us like the next day and wanted to get with us. And we were like, well, okay. But Tim and Jenny were very cautious because you don't know why they wanted to see us again, that kind of thing. But we get there, and we're within a few minutes, she says, can I speak to you privately? And I said, well, sure. So there was a outside decking area. So we stepped out there, and we were just talking, and she started asking me questions about Jesus. And then she said, please tell me how to find Jesus. And I said, okay, let's do this. And so I shared with her, and then she said, yes, please, I want to do that. And so we prayed together, and she was over the moon. And she came in and told her then boyfriend at the time, and we all kind of went our separate ways after that.
But while we were talking to them, it was utterly exhausting. because thankfully they could speak some English because we couldn't speak any Vietnamese, of course. So it was just exhausting. And Janet would speak for a while, then I would talk for a while, and we would just go back and forth. But during this period of time, while Janet was taking her turn, this thought of abundant life kept coming to me. By the time we got done, I just felt like God was telling me, what I've given you specifically today, telling people about my perfect son, is abundant life. And if you and Janet will follow me, I will lead you to abundant life. And so I thought, maybe we're supposed to do this. Maybe we're supposed to be called to missions. You asked earlier, if kind of what pointed us towards missions. And for me, that was the moment. That was an ironclad, stake in the ground moment.
And then fast forward to 2007, he had just retired from the police department. And so we said, okay, we're going to Vietnam. We're going to celebrate. When we returned, I looked at him and I said, okay, let's do it. Let's pack it up. If we're going to do this, let's do it. Because we'd been talking about it off and on since that other trip. Mm-hmm. And he looked at me and he goes, no, I've been thinking. And I went, of course.
As we continue to pray through this, I had a strong sense in my spirit that our house was supposed to be paid for before we left. And I kept coming back to, I think our house is supposed to be paid for. I think that's the right time. Whether I was right or wrong, I don't know. But I stuck to that, feeling like it was God speaking to my heart and telling me, I want you to be all mine when you leave.
I was really frustrated. I was ready to go, but I knew he was right. So there was a lot of God teaching us both different things going on there. We had, from that conversation, we had a year before the house was paid off. I said, okay, Lord, we need you to be in every step. So we started looking at jobs. But meanwhile, we're having this conversation with our friends who had been transferred from Vietnam to Thailand in the dormitory there that was owned by that International Mission Board that housed students of families, missionary families in other areas of the region that didn't have high schools for the kids. And so these kids would come to Chiang Mai and they took the job as dorm parents. And so we used to joke with them all the time. Okay, so if you ever need anybody just to do a little grunt work, give us a call. We'll be there in a minute.
Were you also going through the process with the IMB at that time, application?
We did start that process, not before the house was paid off. We started the process, yes.
We got an invitation to go to candidate conference for an interviewing process in Virginia. We attended that.
A few weeks later, we got a letter of rejection.
Before the trip, Tim and Jenny called us and said, listen, we have a board of directors over the school and we have to meet with them. And we've been telling them for months now that we need help. And they finally agreed. And they said, yes, you can have some assistant dorm parents. And we put your names on the job. And they agreed. I just kind of went, okay. And I hung up and I called him. He was at work. And I said, okay, well, we either need to fish or cut bait because here we are. And he said, okay. That led to all of this. So our name was on this job. People knew our name was on this job.
Yeah.
And then we get this
rejection
denial letter. Yeah. I came up here to the church office and brought the letter with me, ended up in Michael's office and handed it to him and said, what do I do with this? What does this mean? What is this? And he opened it up. He read it. He looked at me and I was going, and he said, this is the enemy. It will work out. You guys are supposed to be there and it'll work itself out, but you just have to stop it. You have to know that this is the enemy. And I just kind of took a deep breath and I said, okay, I'm better now. So we worked through it. We got that cleared up. It took a little while. And then we got the invitation to go to training in Virginia. Then about a week later, we get a phone call and everything started falling apart at the dorm. And it was a situation that the reason that they called us was to tell us so that we could change our minds. The commitment was already made. He had already gave us 2 weeks notice, so we can't. Everyone I talked to could not give a good explanation. And as it turned out, it literally had been put under somebody's pile of files and completely dismissed.
But that was our rejection.
Then they'd tell us after all this other stuff happened, it would really be okay with us if you would skip training and just pack your bags and go now. And we said, gosh, that sounds really good, but no. I mean, we still had things that we were trying to put in place. So all of that was happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for those who are listening, the International Mission Board, like, they're very thorough. And when you're going through that and you're so dedicated, to get a rejection letter is so painful. But in the end, the Lord worked it out and you guys got to Thailand.
The verse that he gave us from the beginning was Jeremiah 33:3. Call to me and I will answer you, and I will show you great and marvelous things. And he certainly did. And so fast forward, we do go through the training and moving on. And in January of 2010, we flew out to Chiang Mai, Thailand. And a week later, I'm sick. A few weeks after that, our daughter calls us and tells us she's pregnant, unmarried, with child number 3. 3 weeks after that, I get a phone call and my nephew's been killed in a logging accident, freak logging accident. It's becoming clearer that my mom has dementia. And we're pretty certain at this time the missionaries that we're working with are taking bets on how long we're going to last before we go back home, because things for 6 months just were hitting us pretty hard.
And then we thought we were supposed to be fill-in dorm parents for one semester. And then we get there and our boss said, oh, by the way, you're going to do the whole school year. We were kind of doing the dorm thing so that we could go evangelize the last year and a half we were there. And so then all of a sudden we find out, no, we're going to be in the dorm for an entire year by ourselves. And it was like, and of course I'm thinking selfishly at that point, and I'm only thinking about us, and I'm thinking, I just wanted to come here to tell people about Jesus.
Yeah.
And it's not that there weren't students there to minister to, but I felt kind of like, okay, I'm paying my dues being a dorm parent, and then I'm going to get to go do what I want to do, right? Hear me? I want to do that. And so everything was kind of getting thrown up in the air and it was getting changed.
Right before we left to, Ed taught in a Sunday school class here. And before we left, literally just a couple of weeks before we left, our Sunday school class presented us with a gift. And the gift were 2 tickets for our granddaughters to come to Thailand to see us. In the midst of all of those things that were happening after we arrived, we also get a phone call that our daughter's being sued by the girl's dad to keep them from coming to Thailand. All of this was going on around us, and I just kind of flipped. I was frustrated at him. And Ed looked at me and he goes, you need to stop it. And I thought, what in the world? And he is just all over me. You need to stop it. You are letting Satan get a hold of you. This has to stop, Janet. You know better than this. And anyone that knows me knows that I usually would have spoken right back, but I couldn't. I just looked at him and I thought, he's right. The next couple of days, I had to spend this time going to the Lord and saying, help me, what do I do? Well, he was very clear, and he put me in the Word. Not only did he put me in the Word, but he instructed that I was going to read through the entire Bible. Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, he wanted me to start in Joshua and perfection, because anybody that knows Joshua understands that Joshua was someone who wasn't afraid to go into a battle. He knew that the Lord God was with him. That gave me this incredibly overwhelming sense of security, peace. I had this urge to fight. Most of the time we didn't know what we were fighting, but we knew we were in the fight, and we knew we were going to win. He showed up in a big way just a few months later. I had read through until I was in the story when David's son is chasing after him, wanting to kill him. And David is praying and asking the Lord, confuse and confound this conversation, Lord. And that struck a chord with me. And one morning, as I'm praying with the Lord, I went to him with that story, that lesson. And I said, Lord, I believe if you can do this for David, you can do this for me. And would you please perform that? It was such a powerful time of prayer for me. And a few weeks later, we had to travel to Bangkok to get our visas updated. And so we're in this huge room of all these people. And I get this text from my sister and says, everything worked out. We're coming to see it.
So you were able to have them come visit you guys.
And so they came in and stayed 2 weeks with us.
Oh, that's sweet. During this time, you are dorm parents kind of reluctantly, but you get introduced to a mission where you end up on the streets. Tell me about that.
He is introduced to a man, and I'm having lunch with a friend, and the conversation that I have and the conversation that he has catapults us in a completely different direction than we ever thought was going to happen. Her conversation was regarding a ministry that she and a couple of other ladies had pondered on and about, because there was an area in Chiang Mai that everyone knew as the red light district. They wondered if there was a way we could get into that. I said, oh my goodness, if you guys actually get to do that, I want a piece of that action. And she just smiled and she goes, okay. A couple of weeks later, she calls and she says, you know what? We got 7 of us. Do you want to go? We're going to go such and such night. We're just going to prayer walk, because, you know, that's what Baptist women do. We go and we prayer walk first. I said, yes, indeed. I want to go. And so we go that night. We park. We have to walk down a couple of blocks to get to where this street is. We're walking through an alley. Everyone's really on fire for what God might show us. And I remember as I get to the corner, I hit the corner and I stopped and I looked down that street and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm home. All I could hear was Jeremiah 33:3. Call to me and I will answer you, and I will show you great and amazing things that you don't even know. And so I started walking up and down that street with those other ladies that night, and we just prayed.
Yeah. Ed, what were you doing with your wife in a not so great place?
Well, I had been frustrated because I always wanted to try to find a way to connect with some of the Thai police officers.
Okay.
And they are very unapproachable people. And then one day I get an email from a friend and it said, hey, I know a guy who is looking for a cop or a retired cop to help him get his foot in the door at the Chiang Mai Police Department. Would you be interested in doing that? Yeah. Because I just had no way of doing it. So I set up a time to go meet this Thai native. His name was Joe. His American name was Joe. He was an attorney, and he grew up in a Christian orphanage. And he had gone to law school and graduated from law school and loves the Lord. And he based his entire business on reaching people for Christ. We got together and we met a couple times and prayed together, and we decided to try to kind of hold hands and see what we could do. And he knew one Thai policeman that worked at one of the substations there. We got together, went over there one day just to have coffee. And he told me, I said, I just want you to be a bridge builder, because he said, I can't do that. And so we went over and we just started talking police work. I mean, how they did things in Thailand, how we did things in America, why they were different, why our Bill of Rights changed the way we did things, and why their laws made it different for them. And we started becoming friends, and the group got bigger and bigger and bigger. For months, that's all I did. I didn't say one spiritual thing to anybody for months, because I was just trying to build a bridge. And I was praying that as we became friends, they would see something different in me that they didn't have. And then eventually I was able to begin to talk to them about Christ and my faith and what was important to me. Eventually we got to be good enough friends to where I would go to work with them. There was a guy that I would go to work with. He was a commander at one of the substations, and I'd go in the mornings and spend 4 or 5 hours with him, and I wouldn't stay the whole day. But I would spend time with him and kind of watch what he did, and then he would ask me how we would do things in America and what we would have done differently, that kind of thing. And eventually we got to be good enough friends where we would go to gatherings with them, and Janet and I threw a party on the 3rd floor of the guest house in Chiang Mai that the IMB owned. We threw a big party for them, and they came, and we just tried to build community with them and tried to tell them the truth about Christ. And my friend Joe, of course, he was there the whole time, and he was involved in that as well. And he got to develop more and more friends because of what we had done. And it was a time of bridge building at the beginning. That was really the key, is just trying to build a bridge for Joe, because we knew we were leaving.
Mm-hmm.
The things that I got to do, it never ceased to amaze me. With each thing that the Lord opened up the door for me to learn, I would just be in awe, because I didn't see any of that coming. So to be able to participate in that at night and speak to those women and tell them about the Lord, and to see on their faces that they believed everything that I was telling them, even though they didn't make a decision, I always felt like, man, this is just where I wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
And there were so many awesome things that happened. And then there were so many hard things. There are still today images in my mind I wish I had never seen, and I can't get rid of them. They're always going to be there. But again, you think about the Lord when he says, trust me, I'm going to show you some things.
Mm-hmm.
He did. He showed both of us these pieces of ourselves that we didn't even know existed. Fast forward, we come home, and that first year, I remember somewhere along the line, I found myself praying and saying to the Lord, Lord, I'm really bored. Within a matter of a week, maybe two, they were holding a function for women here at church, and one of the speakers was from Oklahoma City, and she had a ministry in the red light district in Oklahoma City. And so it was the last breakout for the day, and I went, and I was listening to her because I thought maybe there's some information there that I can use to help start, something.
Mm-hmm.
And unbeknownst to me, there was another woman sitting in the back of the room, and she was drawn to it. And for her, a few days later, she said, there's got to be somebody that I know that knew. And then she thought of me. And so she and I started going out one night a week, and she and I would only go and sit. That's all we would do. We did this for months. We needed to pray, Lord, how do we reach them? What should we do? And he began to unfold all of these things. He brought together a team here at Evergreen of 12 people, and we did street ministry work for 6 years. It developed over time, and praying and listening to the Lord's instruction and the things we were supposed to put together. And we ended up putting together paper bags of lunches. And because of the areas, there were also these motels, and we would knock on the doors and tell them who we were, what we were doing, did they need food? And I can't tell you how many times you would hear someone say, man, we haven't eaten for 2 days. We had no idea where our next meal was going to come from. It was so awesome and interesting the way the Lord would open up the doors for that.
As we come to an end with your story for now, if there's somebody listening today that maybe they're inspired to go overseas and give missions a try, or maybe they're really interested in reaching out to women in hard situations, what is something that you would want to say to them?
For me, it would be, if you think the Lord is speaking to you in that way, then be obedient and let him begin to unravel it all for you, because he will.
Ed, is there anything that you would want to say to someone?
If you are a follower of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit is in you, you already have everything you need to speak to people about Christ. So don't let the lack of Bible knowledge stop you. Don't let the lack of anything stop you, because that's just Satan whispering in your ear.
I think something that your personal testimony shows as well is that God uses ordinary people. You can just be somebody who found Lord when you were in your 30s, grew from there, and felt a calling, and just were obedient. Thank you for tuning in and listening to today's episode. If you have any questions or want to hear about our church, please visit our website at evergreenbc.org. That is evergreenbc.org.